This documentary looks at the life of Isabella of Valois, the second wife of King Richard II of England. In this documentary we try to look at who Isabella was, the life she had and the events surrounding. Isabella was born in Paris on Monday 9 November 1389. Her father was King Charles VI of France, who had also been known as Charles the Beloved or Charles the Mad. He earned the title of Charles the Mad due to severe mental illness, probably due to bipolar or schizophrenia which plagued him later in his life. Isabella's mother was Isabelle of Bavaria, daughter of Duke Stephen III of Bavaria-Ingolstadt. Isabella was one of 12 children born to her parents. Of these siblings, 4 don't survive infancy, including her eldest sibling who had died before her birth. Although being the eldest surviving child, she would not go on to inherit the French throne due to laws of inheritance. Her youngest surviving brother, Charles VII, would eventually inherit the throne from her father in 1422. By the age of 6 years old in early 1396, negotiations would take place between England and France would take place for Isabella to marry the widowed King of England, Richard II. Richard's first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had passed away 1394, and England was ready for the king to look for a new wife to forge political alliances. There were great difficulties in the arranging the marriage as Richard II was 22 years older than Isabella, who was still only a child. An issue which Richard saw would improve every day. Richard would also demanded a dowry of 2 million gold francs for the marriage. But the French negotiated this down to 800,000 francs with an initial installment of 300,000 francs. The marriage would take place in Calais in the Church of Saint Nicholas, just before Isabella's 7th birthday. There is some contradiction of the actual date of the ceremony, with some sources stating it as the Monday 31 October 1396 and others as the Friday 4 November of the same year. Richard was 22 at the time of the wedding. Also at this time, 5 of Isabella's siblings, including the future king, had not been born. Due to laws in both countries, it was agreed that the marriage could not be consummated until Isabella's 12th birthday. This, in Richard's opinion, would allow him time to shape Isabella's character into being the perfect English queen. Also, it would enable England and France to renew a strong pact during a time of peace during the bloody 100 Years' War between the two nations. Isabella apparently told the English representatives that she was happy to become Queen of England as she knew this would turn her into an important and great lady. Directly after the wedding, Isabella would travel to England with her new husband, Richard. She would have her own court set up for her at her new residence at Windsor Castle in Berkshire. Due to her young age, she would also need a governess as well as chief lady-in-waiting, which would become a combined role for her. On Sunday 8 January 1397, Isabella was escorted to Westminster Abbey where she would be officially crowned Queen of England. She would become the youngest ever Queen Consort of England at age of 7. Life for such a young consort would soon become very turbulent. Isabella and Richard would develop a caring and loving relationship. Although due to the vast age gap between them it would be a platonic relationship. And their relationship was more like father-daughter or uncle and niece. Richard would show Isabella great respect and Isabella would look forward to Richard's regular visits to her at Windsor Castle. Here he would lavish her with gifts and toys befitting her age, and engage in entertainment and humor for both Isabella and her ladies-in-waiting. Despite their relationship being platonic, a politically arranged marriage and their vast difference in age, which led him to be unable to consummate the marriage. There is no evidence that Richard II had any mistress during this period. This is not to say there were any mistress during any period of his life, just that there is nothing that has been documented. It could be possible that Richard did have a lover, especially as his first wife had died. But due to his controlling nature he could have easily kept this secret. When Isabella was a mere 9 years old, great political movements started to shift her fortune in life. Whether she would have been mentally aware of what was happening is quite doubtful, as for a child so young much would have been kept from her. Particularly for her own safety. In May 1939, Isabella was moved to Porchester Castle on the south coast near Portsmouth in Hampshire. Isabella was moved for her own safety and protection, whilst her husband, Richard, went on a much controversial military campaign in Ireland. In the meantime, in France, her father would lose the throne of France when her uncle, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, would claim the regency of the French throne due to her father's increasing mental health issues. The change on leadership on the throne would have a negative effect on Isabella. Her uncle decided to allow the return of her husband's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, to return from his exile in Brittany to England. Due to Louis believing the country's relationship with England was no longer in the interests of France. Henry Bolingbroke was a man with a grievance with Isabella's husband. This was due to Richard seizing the Lancastrian lands of Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, who had passed away earlier in the year. Bolingbroke, on his return, would draw support from many lords in England and managed to take power in the country with little resistance. Bolingbroke, on his return, would draw support from many lords in England and managed to take power in the country with little resistance. Edmund Langley, Duke of York, another son of Edward III and uncle to both Richard and Henry, would eventually side with the latter. Edmund would move Isabella around the country, firstly to Wallingford Castle and later to Leeds Castle near Maidstone in Kent. On his return to England, on 19 August 1399, Richard would surrender to Henry and eventually imprisoned in the Tower London on 1 September that year. Bolingbroke would be crowned Henry IV of England on Sunday 13 October 1399, which was coincidentally the feast day of Edward the Confessor. Isabella was kept as a virtual prisoner by this stage the Bishop of Salisbury's residence, Sunning's Bishop's Palace in Reading, Berkshire. Bolingbroke would spare Isabella's husband's life following his abdication. This would soon change when a number of lords who had served her husband and had been demoted by Bolingbroke would meet with Isabella at Sunning Bishop Palace to plot what has become known as the Epiphany Rising. The plot would fail, and Isabella would be moved under heavy guard to Havering Palace in Essex. Bolingbroke would now decide that as long as Richard II remained alive he would still be a figurehead to revolt against his throne. Isabella's husband, Richard II, would die on or around Friday 14 February 1400 at Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire. Most likely from starvation. The death of Richard led to more tension between the English and French throne. Louis I demanded that Isabella should be returned to France. French ambassadors would race to England to try and secure Isabella's release and advise her not to marry anyone the new king proposed. But Bolingbroke insisted that he wanted her to marry his son, Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V. At the age of 11, in 1401, Isabella would bluntly refuse this marriage whilst in mourning and loyalty for her late husband. Eventually, Bolingbroke would sign a treaty at Lullingham to agree the safe return of Isabella to France in May 1401. She was formally returned home at Calais on Tuesday 21 July 1401 to the Count of St. Pol. Isabella would return to her home in August 1401. The dowry the French had paid at Isabella's marriage to Richard and was to be repaid to the French if the marriage was never consummated, was kept by Bolingbroke as England had spent all the money and was unable to repay it, although Isabella was able to return to France with all her jewels. Bolingbroke's son, Henry of Monmouth, would eventually marry Isabella's younger sister, Catherine of Valois in 1420. When Isabella was 16 years old, she would marry her paternal first cousin, Charles, on Sunday 29 June 1406, who was 11 years old at the time. Charles was the son of her uncle, Louis I, Duke of Orleans. The next year in 1407, Isabella's uncle Louis I was assassinated by John the Fearless, son of Philip the Bold. Louis and Philip had a bitter rivalry going back to when Louis claimed regency for his brother during episodes of his mental illness. Isabella's husband would become Duke of Orleans and she would become Duchess of Orleans. In 1409, Isabella would become pregnant for the first time with her new husband. But tragedy in Isabella's life would strike again on 13 September 1409 when Isabella went into labor. Isabella would give birth to a girl who would be called Joan of Valois. But the strain of childbirth would be too much for Isabella and she would pass away on the same day at the age of 19. Death of mothers during childbirth was very dangerous during this period and the result of death was very high. Isabella would be buried in the Abbey of Saint-Lorme of Blois in Blois, a commune to the southwest of Paris. Over time, her final resting place would be forgotten until being rediscovered in 1624 wrapped in bands of linen and plated with mercury. She will be reinterred at the convent of the Celestines in Paris, which has been regarded as the second most important royal burial site in France. Unfortunately, this site suffered a vast amount of damage and desecration during the French Revolution when anti-royalty sentiment ran very high, leading to violent and horrific consequences. Isabella's second husband Charles would marry 2 more times before dying in 1465.